And get started. I think most of you know the work of the Friends Committee on National Legislation, but let me just say a couple of words about FCNL. This is the Quaker Welcome Center, which is operated by the Friends Committee on National Legislation. We are a Quaker lobbying group founded in 1943. We work here on Capitol Hill on a whole range of issues that deal with peace and justice and environmental sustainability. And part of our vision is that we seek a world free of war and the threat of war. So that encompasses a lot of work that deals obviously with nuclear weapons, but deals with a whole range of other peace and security issues that FCNL lobbies on here on Capitol Hill. In addition to the work that we do here lobbying, we have a broad network of people across the country who engage with us, which is tremendously exciting because we're really trying to build capacity for people to develop relationships with their own members of Congress and to stay with those members of Congress on these issues that are so fundamentally important to both humanity and to the livelihood of people in this country. So we welcome, if you're not already involved in another organization, I know some people here are, we always welcome participation. Quakers are involved with us because we are a Quaker organization, but we also have engagement from a lot of people from a lot of different sectors. So let us know if you'd like to do more with us. In addition, so I talked about our lobbying work. This building was redeveloped a couple of years ago as an effort to have just this kind of forums. We have had some bipartisan dialogue on climate change with a couple of both Republican and Democrat members of Congress. We initially thought about the work of the Quaker United Nations office that does quiet conversations in spaces that aren't always public or available, but trying to find the common ground that we know is absolutely essential to advance public policy. So that's a little bit about us and what we do. I didn't introduce myself. I will tell you, I'm Diane Randall. I am the Executive Secretary of the Friends Committee on National Legislation. And in addition, there are a number of staff here with us tonight. But the person I'd like to introduce right now to talk a little bit about the specific work we do on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation is Anthony Weyer. And Anthony's been with us for, gosh, 2.5 years, 3? Almost 2 years. So we're thrilled to have him working with us. Anthony comes from a background having, he can explain some of what his own history is, but he worked for the Senate Foreign Services Committee, where he has worked on the New START Treaty. He worked at the State Department and worked in policy and planning there, and has himself a long history of paying attention to the issues of nuclear disarmament and trying to create a safer world and the elimination of nuclear weapons. So Anthony, if you could just spend a little bit of time talking about, one of the concerns that we're going to talk about when Bea comes and when Tim talks is that for many of us in this room, we would be all about abolishing all nuclear weapons immediately. But the fact is that we're dealing with a Congress, and we're one of the powers that really has a bully pulpit on nuclear weapons. So talk a little bit about the state of play, both in terms of Congress and sort of what we're facing both at FCNL as we do our lobbying work, and what the opportunities are.
Sure, happy. And first of all, thanks to everyone for coming. So as Diane said, I'm Anthony Weyer. And the interesting thing about tonight for me is that the first time I heard about Beatrice Fihn and ICAN was when I was at the State Department, hearing about this organization and this movement on humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. It was causing all sorts of mischief, and it was really frustrating the State Department, and they weren't really sure quite what to do with it. So here I am. It's funny how the world turns. And here I stand before you as the Legislative Secretary for Nuclear Disarmament. So really the focus, I would say, for our work tends to be here in Washington and here dealing with the Hill, as Diane said. So I was working on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee with for then Senator John Kerry when we got the New START Treaty through the Senate, where we worked. I mean, it was a year of my life trying to get this treaty through. And you think about it today, that treaty allowed, under its counting rules, for 1,550 nuclear weapons. I was doing the math just the other day. Under the current U.S. posture, it actually ends up being more, something like 2,000 or so weapons because of the way the bombers are counted. And all of that debate, that months of debate, it was kind of astonishing. I kept a lot of times thinking to myself, what in the world could we possibly do with weapon 1551? Like, what possible thing could we not solve? Like, or what would we need with that? And yet here we were having this knockdown, drag out political fight. And the reality is right now we're back to that. So the administration is pushing new designs for what it calls low yield nuclear weapons, which are in fact nothing of the sort. They would have transformed the world at the time, or say in 1945. It's a total misnomer. And yet the administration has asked for money. Congress has given money. We just saw reports over the last couple of weeks that the administration has produced the first weapon. We're trying a sort of last dash effort to keep that one from getting deployed. Of course, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty is a 30-year-old treaty that had banned an entire class of weapons that carried nuclear weapons and brought the Cold War to some of its most tense moments since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and was abolished in this dramatic moment. The Russian Federation has been cheating on this treaty. The United States has walked away in response, which is about like, trying to stop someone who keeps running red lights by pulling down all the stoplights. It doesn't really make much sense, sorry. And then now we have, I think, one other thing we're working on is a sort of simple idea, which is that the United States shouldn't use nuclear weapons first. And for me, and for someone who worked at the policy planning staff at the State Department, where we were in essence trying to think long-term about US national security strategy, I keep coming back to the idea of what a disaster it would be the day after the United States is the one that uses another nuclear weapon in warfare first. What a disaster that would be for the United States. Not leaving aside, if you would, for a moment, as if you could, the moral disaster, the humanitarian disaster. But from the United States' perspective, from the government's perspective, they should be thinking of it as a strategic disaster as well. And then finally, the New START treaty, the treaty I worked on very hard, and we've helped get through the Senate, is very much in danger right now. And I can't describe to you the frustration I feel. This treaty is a remarkable thing. Every 6 months, the Russian Federation has to give the United States a complete report of where all its bombers, where all its missiles, where all its nuclear submarines are. It's exactly the kind of thing we were just discussing last week in Hanoi as what would have been a magical unicorn of a deal. And in fact, we have that deal right now with the much larger, more dangerous Russian Federation. They have to update us all the time on where they're moving their forces. We get notifications when a new missile is produced and leaving. And yet there are plenty of people in this town and some in the administration who would voluntarily lift the restraints and blind ourselves to the Russian nuclear arsenal. I can't for the life of me understand why we would do that. So that's why we're working on the inside. But I will tell you, I've been kind of an insider guy all through my career. I've been kind of working in Washington. And I want to kind of turn it over to Timon, because I think what's really exciting, and I go back to that story I told at the State Department where, the kind of insider Washington folks they couldn't even fathom, they couldn't even grasp what was happening. They didn't even see it coming. They didn't really know how to deal with it. And it's completely transformed the international diplomatic landscape. And that's what I see continuing to happen after the ban treaty was signed. That official Washington, in a large degree, doesn't know what's happening. It doesn't really see what's happening around the world. And it certainly doesn't see what's happening around the country, where there's just not even a conversation happening and there's a total disconnect. And in a way, that's kind of exciting because I think it offers a real opportunity to really change the conversation and kind of when the people come a-calling and say, no, you've got it exactly wrong. We need to be going in a different direction. So with that, I think it makes sense to maybe hear from Timon, and he can tell us about some of his efforts before he gets here.
And if I might just do a brief introduction of Timon, so you all know a little bit more about him. I met Timon last summer for the first time, but I think he's probably better known to some people in this room. Timon Milne-Wallace is Executive Director of Nuclear Ban US, and he holds a PhD in Peace Studies from Bradford University. He's been executive director of the Nonviolent Peace Force and directed peace building projects in Colombia, Guatemala, Mexico, Ireland, Kosovo, Georgia, Myanmar, Chechnya, Croatia, Sri Lanka, Philippines, and South Sudan. He's also served as the executive editor of Peace News of the National Peace Council in the UK. He has a new book called Disarming the Nuclear Argument, The Truth About Nuclear Weapons, which analyzes the cost. And he has a fan here, the cost, the accident risk, the legality of nuclear weapons, and the absurdity of the whole concept of perpetuating nuclear weapons as deterrence. The book played a role in the successful July 2017 United Nations negotiations for a nuclear ban treaty, and it's a handbook for those seeking a safer, saner world. And he is joined by his wife, Vicki Elson. Vicki is also a co-founder of the Nuclear Ban US and serves as the creative director. She's also executive director of Treaty Awareness US. For 35 years, she's worked as a childbirth educator, a filmmaker, and a labor support doula. So Tim's going to come up and talk a little bit about Nuclear Ban US, and then there might be a little conversation between Anthony and Tim until Bea gets here. And when she gets here, we're going to let her breathe for 1 minute, and then we'll bring her up and we'll warmly welcome her to speak. So Tim, please come on up. And let's give you the mic here. So thank you. Great.
So before I forget, this is the book. And they're for sale in the back if you haven't got one already. And I would normally do this with Vicki, but she's outside flagging down Bea's car, so hopefully they'll both be here in a minute. But I was asked to share one story from the treaty. So I actually was working for Quakers in Britain, doing Anthony's job in the UK on behalf of Quakers in the UK, and oh, that's them. Sorry. No, it's not. Actually, that's probably her office ringing. You want to try that? Oh, jeez. Yeah, thanks. Anyway, I was at the negotiations with some others in the room who were part of the negotiations going on at the UN 2 years ago, and I was there on behalf of Quakers in Britain, and also 4 other churches in the UK. And my book was one of the contributions. It was co-published by Quakers in the UK, and was donated to all the UN missions so that they could read up on the issues. But I met Vicki just a few days before I went on one of the sessions, and so I brought her along on our 4th date, and we got married after that. So I come to this from another country which also has nuclear weapons and also has the division between people who are, on the streets and getting arrested, and all the sort of hardcore activism on the one side, and on the other, trying to find realistic ways of negotiating with members of parliament about, the next step that they could take, and everything in between. And this treaty came along at a moment when Britain was going through a huge upheaval about whether to modernize its nuclear weapons, and so it was a huge national debate. And the thing which you'll find out for yourself in a few moments when Bea turns up is that, and other people here can vouch for it who've been involved in this movement, ICAN is an unbelievably inspiring movement that's mostly young people that are, half my age or less, and who are coming from the most unlikely countries like Netherlands, but also, Colombia and Costa Rica and Peru, Kazakhstan. There's a very active group in Kazakhstan. They're all over. There's now more than 500 organizations in 100 countries, part of the ICAN movement. And it's been so inspiring to be part of this and to be witnessing history. And what's happened, and to back up what Anthony was saying, you know, they started this going around, firstly to just peace organizations, and people said, you know, you're wasting your time. This is pointless. You know, we've tried all this before. You know, all these upstart young people don't know what they're doing yet. And they just said, well, we're not, that's not going to stop us. And then they did it, you know. And so we've been following this ever since, and trying to support the treaty here in the US, where we were told by everybody when the treaty was signed in 2017, we were told no member of Parliament of the US Congress is going to ever support this treaty, or even, you know, it's not going to be on the discussion, it's not going to be on the agenda in this country. So forget it, you know, work on something else. And we now have 6 members of Congress, which is not very many, but it's a start. We've been meeting with some of the staff today, and Bea is going to be going around the next 2 days, meeting with quite a few members of Congress, which partly to set up a meeting with the Progressive Caucus, which is, I think, 90 members of Congress, which will happen in a couple of months. So we're on a roll here, and as you know, outside of this country, this treaty is a huge thing in so many countries that you wouldn't imagine. I don't know how many people here know about what's happening in Australia, but there are elections in Australia in April. The Labour Party is polling to win that election, and they voted in December, or no, early January, they voted to sign the treaty, Australia, which is one of the main, you know, US partners in Asia. The same thing is happening in countries like Spain. The Spanish government has I mean, no one knows what's going to happen next in Spain, but they have an agreement with Podemos, which is the radical party, to get through their budget. And part of the agreement was that Spain would sign this treaty. The same thing is going on in Switzerland, in Netherlands, in Germany, in Norway, Sweden. You know, these are countries that are on board, and sooner or later are going to sign this treaty, and it is going to have a huge impact on this country that people don't realize yet. And so that's what keeps us going.
Yep. And there she
here
is.
they are. Hooray. I'm filling in for you until you get here. Thank you.
Yeah, Bea, welcome.
Yeah.
Take your coat off, take a breath, and we'll have you come up and speak. Tim, thank you so much. And I hope that when we get to Q&A, that we'll be able to hear a little bit about some of the strategies in the US as well, because I think that while it's been, you know, you said that we have 6 out of, you know, what we need, you know, 535, but, oh, sorry, which microphone do I use? I think those strategies are really important to understand a little bit, that you're doing some work at the state level as well. So I think that's important to know. And then the other part, I think, is to show how that can relate internationally too. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and just read a little bit about Bea, so you'll know a little bit more about her. Bea, come on up. We'll ask Tim to take a seat for now. You and I'll sit up here. Just why don't you sit right here for now? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to just go ahead and tell you a little bit about Bea.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. She is welcome. Thank you so glad you're here.
I'm so sorry I'm late.
What a sport.
Yeah.
So can I give you that to you, Christine? This mic, thanks. So Bea is the executive director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize winning campaign. She accepted the Nobel Peace Prize and delivered the Nobel Lecture in Oslo on behalf of the campaign in 2017. So if you go to the website, you can read the lecture that she gave for that. I first got to hear her speak at a Plowshares conference a couple of years ago, and I was just delighted to meet her and to hear her speak and to sort of sense the inspiration and that she's going to talk about today, I think, too. She's led the campaign since 2013 and has worked to mobilize civil society throughout the development of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This includes developing and executing ICAN's political strategy and fundraising efforts, as well as representing the campaign in relation to media and key stakeholders such as governments, the UN, and other international organizations. She has over a decade of experience in disarmament diplomacy and civil society mobilization through her work with ICAN, with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and the Geneva Center for Security Policy. She has a Master's of Law from the University of London and a bachelor's degree in international relations from Stockholm University. We really welcome you here tonight to the Quaker Welcome Center. Let me just say a word about who's in the room. So obviously you know Tim and Vicky, but you also have some staff from the Friends Committee on National Legislation. So they will introduce themselves. You have other people who work for organizations that are working on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. You have people who care deeply about the future of the world, on the planet. And so want to hear from you about this particular treaty and about the campaign. So how did you get started? Tell us a little bit about ICAN and about, so I mean, there's so many questions I want to ask. I want to ask about where you think it's going, but why don't we just start with where ICAN started and why you think it caught on with such momentum?
First, thank you so much for having me here. It's really, really nice to.
Not really hearing you. Let's see if it turns.
Is it on?
It might have turned off. Yeah.
Like that?
Yeah, you're on. You're on. Yep.
Okay. It's really nice to be here, and a lot of ICAN partners in the audience and people that have been part of the campaign. Well, you know, I just actually today. Feels like yesterday when I went on the plane, but today it was the anniversary actually of the 6 years ago since we were in Oslo for the first conference on the humanitarian consequences, humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. And of course, ICAN is a few years older than that conference, but I think that's really when ICAN started to separate and kind of find its unique voice. This idea of cutting through all of the technological conversations around nuclear weapons, all the acronyms, all the strategic stability and power balance, and talk about what these weapons really are. Weapons of mass destruction that are meant to mass murder civilians. And it's so often in this work that you get almost distracted from what they are and kind of normalizing these weapons. And we were trying to sort of bring it back and reframe the issue. I mean, it's just fascinating to think that we have banned landmines, not the United States, but the rest of the world. almost the United States done it. It's getting there very slowly. But you know, all these countries in the world have banned landmines because they have indiscriminate impact on civilians. And
Did it turn on?
But it's not legal.
it's a bad battery.
Do you mind using this?
No, no,
We also have a Facebook Live.
Great.
That's part of the reason we're doing this.
You know, so we banned because they had indiscriminate impact on civilians. Yet we somehow thought the nuclear weapons were key. So I think that was really what got the whole campaign really going. And it's, in a way, for people who worked on this issue a long time, I know that ICAN can be a little bit provoking because sometimes we get like, this is a new perspective. Of course, it's not new. People have talked about this the whole time. And if you think about it, the concerns of humans and the humanitarian and the environmental impact is what has driven any progress on nuclear weapons in the 60s, in the 50s, 60s. I mean, that has been the fundamental sort of basis. So when we say it's new, it's basically just a marketing ploy to get people to think that something new is happening, but it's really going back to the roots and ban the bomb. I mean, it was the sort of call words from the beginning. So it's not really new. It's building on things that have been done. But just, I think that after the Cold War ended, a lot of the peace movement and the disarmament movement got lost in all the technical stuff and in the kind of arms control focused, and the problem is the countries that want nuclear weapons, not the ones that already have them, and these kind of things. So I think we've done a really good job in kind of helping people to see these weapons again for what they really are.
So I got started in my political life with the Nuclear Freeze campaign back in the 1980s. And I know there are other people in the room that probably got their motivation that way as well. I hadn't been politically active. And 37 years ago, I had my first child, and that did it. I realized how insane it was to have nuclear weapons. And so the humanitarian aspect of needing to do something to address this. And of course, we weren't talking about abolition then, we were talking about the nuclear freeze, but that seemed like a logical first step to get involved. I tell people that the first time I took him for an outing, he was 5 days old, and we went to a meeting for the nuclear freeze campaign. So, so we have this, I feel like I have this connection to this issue, but I will share that I think that part of what has happened over almost 40 years for me is, you know, other issues that may have arisen, and this willingness to say, oh, you know, yeah, it possibly could happen, but you know, that we have these treaties going forward, and there are, you know, people who are, you know, of sound mind that are trying to, you know, make sure that we control nuclear weapons and we never use them. So there's a lot of rationalization going on. And my sense is that for many of us in the United States, that changed pretty dramatically a couple of years ago, because people have really questioned, you know, whether our current administration has the sound judgment. And so I think it has opened up a lot of questions. And yet it is not simply what's happening in this country. I mean, we're seeing other countries. I mean, last week, India and Pakistan, or the discussion with North Korea. So I'm interested in what you're seeing in terms of rising movement on this. You know, do you think it's the political winds that are changing? Do you think it's something to do with, I understand what Tim was sharing is that there are a lot of, there's a real momentum among young people who are part of ICAN. Talk a little bit about the state of the movement right now because of politics.
Yeah, I mean, it's really scary times. And I think that, I mean, I grew up in the 80s, but wasn't part of the movements then. But we're back to that kind of nuclear arms race and having nuclear armed states threaten each other again. And it's extremely scary and really, really, it's real. But yet somehow it's still not really sinking in with people. It's almost, I think that the nuclear weapons issue is a little bit like climate change, shares this kind of like, it's so abstract for people that it's difficult to grasp it. And the consequences are so horrible that, you know, the end of the world, like you can't think about it. So you just push it away and try to think about something else. But I think that now with the changes in the world, I think it's really obvious that these people in power are not going to fix it for us. And I think that's something that we really, not just on the nuclear weapons issue, all the issues, we're just going to have to do it ourselves. And I think that that's what activists have known always, but I think the more sort of general public are also sort of starting to grasp. And I mean, in big moments of crisis, we're also seeing huge developments forward. I mean, the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, and then we had the NPT, and you had the 80s and the tension then, and the nuclear freeze movement. So it also triggers public pressure. And one of the things that was so nice about ICAN winning the Nobel Peace Prize was that it was rewarded to the activists, the regular people. So often when these big achievements happen, it's the presidents or the prime ministers that sign the papers at the end of the day. They get all the cred. Like they just came up with it. I mean, we all know that that's not how it works. Like it's people like us who is like nag and nag and nag and nag even more, and people like, oh, stop nagging, and finally they do something, and then they forgot about us. It's really ungrateful work, that kind of activism work, but it is what really drives things forward. And if we look at everything, gender equality, sort of abolishment of slavery, I mean, this climate change movement with these amazing students that are protesting now. I mean, the gun control debate. I mean, it's people protesting and people taking action and doing things that pushes the politicians. And I think on the nuclear weapons issue, since the 80s, after that big movement, people just sort of expected the politician to solve it. And I think that one of the biggest lessons is that in the United States, for example, you had the most progressive president for 8 years on nuclear weapons.
Right. Who we thought was going to do something really
he was going to, I mean,
important.
and I believe that he honestly wanted to. He wanted to, and he had, you know, some really beautiful words. He went to Hiroshima. It was really beautiful. We had this speech in Prague, but there was no public pressure forcing him. So of course, when you then run up against the quite powerful interest who don't want to do anything, there has to be a political cost for politicians, and that's what we need to bring. But I am really hopeful. I mean, it's extremely depressing to open up the newspapers or click on the links on Twitter today. We don't open newspapers anymore, a lot of people. Because it's like a lot of headlines and it's a lot of very negative, and media still very much focus on these sort of 9 individuals that control these states with influence,
Right.
that they are the only ones that matter. But we know that that's not true. And we're working on other countries, for example, trying to build this kind of momentum and mass movement also with other countries. We're working on local levels with banks, with all of these other things, that we don't have to just sit and nag the leader of a state.
Yeah.
One of the things that we talk about is things like same-sex marriage, for example. There was no presidential candidate that campaigned on that or came in and solved it. People just changed their minds, and suddenly the politicians were like, well, yeah, of course, I always supported that, totally. I mean, that's how progress happens. And I think that we're just going to have to do that again. We're just going to have to change people's minds, and that's a lot easier to change the person next to you's mind than the whole government of a country.
And it comes back obviously to a belief that we can do something. I mean, I think that people need to remember that their voices do make a difference. I mean, that's something that we at FCNL work on with a lot of our colleagues, folks at Peace Action and other places, really trying to motivate individuals to be in dialogue with their elected officials. But I do understand too that sort of the publicity and a sense of movement is really important. I'm going to ask you another question, then I want to let you know that we do want to open this up so that if those of you in the audience have questions that you'd like to ask Bea, we want to make that happen soon. But I want to ask you about the leadership of women in this movement, particularly because we've seen that as a rising issue, and it's been certainly within Washington, D.C., there's a lot of chatter about women in peace and security, and a lot of discussion about where, and I don't mean to make this only a gender issue, but I do think there is a real impetus and a power arising from women who are speaking up more. And so as a woman leader who accepted the Nobel Peace Prize and heads up ICAN, do you have a perspective on that yourself, or do you want to share what your thoughts are?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's so many different aspects to that, and I think that just having 50% of the population participate actively in the decision making is, democratically correct, and also provides for, and not just gender, but also race and education level and all these other issues, of course, as well. But I think that the more diverse decision making is, the better the decisions will be for the whole people. So that's very important. And I don't believe that women inherently biologically are more peaceful, but we often are given caring tasks in society, which means that we have a different perspective on warfare and the military. I think that women very often look at the consequences of society afterwards, whereas men perhaps not are trained or raised in that way. But I think one of the most important things to do now is to use all these women that come in power to also change of what is seen as strong.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that for me, it's not just about putting women on panels. I mean, that's great. It's just a very, but it's just a step, right? And we see, a lot of women in power that show no sort of incentive of being promoters of disarmament, for example. So we also have to dismantle what the sort of gendered norms around this. And I think that one of the difficulties on working on disarmament is that disarmament has inherently been seen as weak. You're giving something up. You're giving something that makes you powerful up. So, and I think that is something we have to really work hard on. I think we have a unique opportunity when people are starting to question norms and starting to question different gender roles and these, what's considered normal. So, and I think that we see that, for example, with the Iran deal, there was a lot of criticism and arguments for withdrawing from the Iran deal based on the fact that Iran got something out of it. They were given a benefit from this deal.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a zero-sum game, that somehow a compromise that works for both parties is seen as weak. You have to dominate, preferably humiliate the other, that's strong and masculine and that kind of thing. So I think that's when we see disarmament, negotiations, diplomacy, compromise, peaceful sort of solutions as weak, we're in very dangerous situation. I think that we have this kind of parallel trend now that we see both women becoming more powerful and questioning these kind of norms, and also a strong authoritarian nationalistic rise
Right.
at the same time. So I think that we can't just take it for granted that, oh, women are going to fix it.
No, no, but so about 5 years ago, the Friends Committee on National Legislation and the American Friends Service Committee worked on a proposal, a framework called shared security, which was looking at reframing the notion of national security to not be about only what's protecting a nation state, but what are we sharing together? And it really took into account the work that a lot of peace building organizations are doing that looks at human security first and foremost. And that idea, I think, is also one that is, thinking about a diversity of perspectives, whether it's nationality or gender or ethnicity, that resonates with people because it is human-centered, just like this movement is human-centered.
Yeah, and I think that, we even named it like soft issues, right? Or soft security or soft politics, which is, immediately, draws attention to the weak.
Right.
And the hard security, it's the number of warheads. And like we would be more protected with lots of more warheads than we were if we had universal healthcare or education for all or things like that. And you can just see which countries are most safe.
Correct.
It's countries like, luckily I come from Sweden, but the countries that invest a lot in healthcare and education have few weapons. I mean, we still have these problems. So I'm not going to say that's a great, perfect society, but it's one of the challenges I find still is that, when you have all the facts, like again, like the gun debate here, that if you have weapons in your home, you're more likely to get shot. Yet people feel safe because it's a masculine, strong kind of like, I'm powerful with this weapon. So we have a huge challenge, but I think also a great opportunity to push that, to change that narrative right now, and to sort of redefine what's strength and power.
Right. It is a moment. It is a watershed moment. We're going to open it up now. Emmett is going to bring a microphone to you, and I ask that you wait for the microphone because of the folks on Facebook Live who need to hear this. That only gets picked up through the mic. So if you have a question, could you raise your hand? Emmett will bring the mic back and introduce yourself so we know who you are and so Bea knows who's in the room. So anyone want to open this up with a question or comment?
Linda Pence-Gunter from Beyond Nuclear. Not sure it sounds I should know that after years of television. So I'm Linda Pence-Gunter. I'm with Beyond Nuclear, which is in the nuclear-free city of Tacoma Park. Yay, Maryland. First city in the US to declare its compliance with the UN treaty ban. So we would actually, before you came, Bea, we were talking about youth and young people and the fact that most of us have been in this issue for a while, 60 plus, and it's refreshing to know that ICAN is sort of a youth movement, but I'm not sure that we're seeing it yet in the US that strongly. And I wondered whether you had any ideas about how to sort of bring home that, not only the sort of clear and present danger piece like climate change seems to work, but also I think with the youth movement, it needs to be kind of fun and exciting as well. And so what has ICAN sort of got up its sleeve maybe to try to energize young people? And just as of an adjunct to that, and Megan and I were talking about, and Megan Rice is here, I'm sure you know, we were talking earlier about sort of academia and whether looking at sort of PhD students, whether they could be encouraged to start to think about what could happen instead, that if we are going to persuade people that we don't need nuclear weapons, could they start to bring out some studies as part of their PhD to show what we can do with nuclear weapons complexes instead? Thank you.
Yeah, the elusive youth, how do you mobilize them? I mean, I think, in a way, it's not so much of lack of mobilizing a new generation, it's lack of mobilizing new people, right, from any generation. I mean, those that are active are the ones that have been active for a long time. So I think one of the biggest challenges is that it is so big, this issue, and people feel so powerless. And I think that ICAN has been very useful in trying to sort of break that down into things that we can do. So it's very hard to talk to some college kids and say, yeah, Kim Jong-un is the problem, fix that. We can't fix that. But your own representative in Congress, for example, could join this thing, or your bank, or your university's endowment fund, for example, invest in nuclear weapons, trying to break it down into manageable pieces that people can understand. And then, of course, also people are quite, a bit of glory supporters. They like to join things that are moving forward. Nobody wants to join a cause that isn't going anywhere. It's extremely demotivating. So I think that that's, again, what we've been very good at in ICAN, is to celebrate very much. We're always celebrating something, even it's a very small progress. We throw parties and we cheer on social media and try to sort of boost this feeling that things are happening, because people that motivates people, and it's really a big sort of community builder. And that comes with having fun. It has to be fun. It's really hard to spend a lot of your working, like your free time, engaging in a thing that is just draining and depressing. And of course, the issue is really depressing, but we can still have fun when we work on it. And that's one of those things that I've heard a lot of people from who were part of the big nuclear freeze movement, for example, talking about how they had so much fun. And in the UK, they had this die-in in Hyde Park, and they just did it. They was like, oh, Friday night, we'll go and do this fun thing. So try to create that kind of sense of enjoying it and finding good people that you like. I don't think we actually need millions of people marching again. I mean, that would be great, but I don't think we can wait for that. And I've seen how much you can do with 100 people, really smart, committed people that know exactly where to push certain things. You can achieve so much with that. So I think that we also have to stop waiting for this big public movement and just go and do stuff. And that's really, we had this sign in the office. Our strategy is doing stuff. Because doing stuff is fun and better. Like, it makes you feel good to do stuff. Doing stuff is better than not doing stuff. And it sort of creates forward motion. And in terms of sort of really making sure that young people also stay around, because I think that there's a lot of young people that do come into the movement, but how do we get them to stay after their internship or after their sort of student years when they have a lot of free time? We need to raise money so we can pay people. I think that's really key. I think that the more people that can actually, instead of going and doing corporate job, do this kind of thing. Because when I talk to young people, they want to work in this field.
Yeah, they do.
They want, but they also want to pay off their student loans and maybe go on a holiday once in a while and have kids, and not perhaps sacrifice the entire kind of lifestyle that we're being pressured to have. That's another conversation. So I think that sort of making sure that there's that we also take care of the people, that we don't see them as disposable, but that we take care of young people that come into the movement, try to find ways to employ people. Same thing as, I think one paid staff person can do a lot more than volunteers that come in and out and new and then disappear for a few years and then come back in. What can I do on a Friday afternoon, but not too much? So I think that it's worth investing, and let young people lead as well. Yeah. And even in ICAN, I mean, I feel like I'm getting one of the older ones now. So I need to let the new generation, really, and let them have their ideas and let them come up with things and let them drive projects. Because I think it's really easy when you've been around for a while to sort of want to enforce like your thoughts, and this is how we did it, and this is what we're going to do now, and this is how we always done it, but to really let people create their own movement and change the movement.
I love that. So do stuff, get out of the way. If somebody else can come into the way and start doing it. And I think sharing stories. I mean, I think the people who've done this work, who have stories to tell, it's a story that should be inspiring, though, not do it this way. This is what I did, and now it's I'm here to have your back, which is also about paying people. Another comment, we have one in the back here. Let's go to the back. Could you introduce yourself too, please, when you speak?
I'm Greg Thielman, a member of the Board of Directors of the Arms Control Association. It seems like in order for us to make progress, we have to put pressure on members of the US Congress. And I just wondered if you have any tips for us on the kind of questions at town hall meetings or in letters to the member of Congress that we can raise. I mean, I heard right before you came a very good question raised by Anthony Weir. What is the value of that 1,551st nuclear weapon? You know, why is that different than the 1,550th nuclear weapon? I mean, it seems like that's the kind of question that really puts people on the spot in really dealing realistically with the horror of any nuclear weapons. But do you have any other sort of tips on how to move this unmovable force of US congressmen that can't even see the value in extending the New START treaty for 5 years?
Oh, yeah, you have a tough job here in the United States. But also, like, with a lot of great new Congress people that I think there can be an opportunity to raise these things. I think our job is to fire people up. And very often, I think that civil society runs the risk of compromising too much in how we ask the politicians. I mean, we know they're going to make compromises. We know that when we say, you know, you have to get rid of all nuclear weapons, they're going to be like, maybe one. But I think that we have to keep the motivation for them there. And I think that's very important to remember, that we have to talk about the humanitarian consequences and talk about the abolition of nuclear weapons, not because we think that they're going to do it now, or that we don't want them to take certain, you know, arms control steps, but because they should take those steps. And if we put the bar down here, then they barely lift their feet. So what one of the things that I know works very well with European politicians is that instead of saying deterrence, for example, I say, oh, you mean threatening to mass murder civilians? And you can see how they like, no, yes, but no, but yes. And just like, you know, change the language. I mean, a lot of the language we use concedes power to the nuclear armed states, to the people that defend deterrence. You know, we call them nuclear powers, and just small things like that. I like in every meeting when we talk about nuclear weapons to just start with a couple of sentences about what nuclear weapons do. The blast, the impact, the radiation, and, you know, I use a lot of like gory, you know, images and that kind of thing, just to get people a little bit on the back foot, right? It's very hard to come out swinging in favor of nuclear weapons when you're talking about, you know, how it, you know, the children that survive risk dying a few years later of cancers. I mean, those kind of things, the kind of impact. So it's not so much exactly what policy thing to ask, but I think the framing is important. And I think framing it around the humanitarian consequences, framing it around a weapon of mass destruction that's targeting civilians. I mean, these weapons are meant to wipe out cities. I mean, that's what they really are for, to wipe out maximum amount of people in the shortest number of time. And they need to, the defenders of this weapon need to own up to that in that case. If that's what they want to defend, we shouldn't make it easy for them and sterilize the debate and make it sort of sanitized to get away with it. And I think this is, again, a bit about how we need to change the perspective, right? What's weak, what's strong. The people who are in favor of nuclear weapons or in favor of keeping them, they've been coming across as realist, as rational, whereas we know it's completely insane. Right. It's crazy. And another thing that is perhaps a little bit more of a policy thing that I think is getting really effective is talking about artificial intelligence and cyber warfare. How that is changing everything. So even if you believe in deterrence, it doesn't matter in the future because it's going to be completely irrelevant. And the way the decision making in warfare is going to change. And what we see now with India and Pakistan also, how extremely sort of nationalistic tendencies on social media triggers a kind of a hateful response, and political leaders respond to that. Right now we're engaging in these modernization programs. They're going to keep nuclear weapons for, what is it, 80 years? 80. I mean, longer than they've existed before. And if we think about artificial intelligence, for example, or the cyber attacks, for example, and the exponential development of that, it's not just, you know, look at where we were 80 years ago. I mean, in the next 5 years, we're going to pass the past 80 years of technology. So where are we going to be in 80 years in terms of military technology? And are we really going to bring in giant radioactive bombs meant to wipe out whole cities into that kind of environment? And that I find is a way to get even the people that believe in deterrence to sort of think about it. It's like, oh yes, we need to have a conversation about this. Maybe their answer probably is going to be, we need to invest more in security and invest more in these technologies. But I think it will start a conversation about how deterrence, you can't just blindly rely on this kind of theory that you're hoping that it won't fail. And I think that that's also important, right? To remember that the realists and the rational ones are just praying that things will continue to be lucky.
Yeah,
I have a comment from one of our Facebook Live people who says, with India and Pakistan on the brink, I'm fired up.
Yeah. Well, I think that of course, PSR have done this report about how nuclear war in India and Pakistan, how it would impact global crops around the world and cut global rice and corn production with about 20% over the next decade, leading to mass starvation in Africa and Asia, here in Europe. Do you trust the leaders of India and Pakistan enough with our shared future? Do the whole people of Africa trust them? Who elected them to sit there and decide over our faith? I mean, it triggers these conversations. Who do they think they are, these people?
good questions. Can I just do a time check on where we are? I don't have a watch on. No, okay, we have about 10 minutes, 10 to 12 more minutes. So Emmett over here, and then maybe back here in the front.
Good evening. I'm Marian Douglas Ungaro from Washington, native Washingtonian, and I want to welcome you to the District of Columbia. I'm actually here for Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and we're activating the DC chapter. Thank you. And so anybody who's interested, talked about women's issues, and certainly that's why WILPF exists. I brought along a handout too that has to do with climate justice, women in peace, because that's our biggest, the climate emergency is the biggest thing we're facing right now. And the issue of the resources that are going toward these weapons and the humanitarian crises that those weapons cause. But there's also the issue of intersectionality, because we're talking about justice, racial justice, environmental justice and environmental racism. Myself, I lived close to 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania when it was put online in the early 1970s. And it changed my life. I was anti-nuclear already, even though my dad was an electrical engineering professor, and it taught him a lesson too. But the issue of uranium mining in communities, primarily communities of color, third world countries, in indigenous Canada, in Native America here in the United States, we have to link up. That's the way the room looks. We have to talk about peace in a broader sense. My last point is that some people here would remember when we had on the table the question of creating a US Department of Peace. And we need to do that. This is at the national level, not so much at the international, but that would affect US foreign policy and domestic policy so much. And former Congressman John Conyers of Michigan and Dennis Kucinich of Ohio were 2 of the members of Congress who were really behind us coming up with the Department of Peace, because we know that the United States Pentagon, there's nothing like it in the world. It's like its own country, really. And having worked in international missions myself, the number of military bases and Americans don't know anything about them. We don't even know why they're there. Then Cynthia McKinney asked some years ago, 2006, I think maybe, she asked Donald Rumsfeld in a public hearing what happened to missing billions of dollars of the Pentagon budget. I hear Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez asking the same question, but now it's in the trillions. Anyway, so, but we in the Americas have a particular history in a situation. You come from Sweden, and frankly, Sweden was involved in the transatlantic slave trade. We even had an area, I think it's now Pennsylvania, was New Sweden that was involved, had slavery. But we don't even know what's going on in our own backyard, what's happening with Venezuela, with Colombia, with Haiti. We don't even get news from the rest of the Americas. We know more about what's going on in Poland and even India and Pakistan than what's going on in Barbados or Jamaica or Haiti. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I ask that we take your comment in the back or question and then back up here and then let respond? Is that okay? So we get all those? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Nooj. I work with PSR, and I would first like to selfishly thank you for advocating for a paycheck for me. That's very great. So I'm interning, but I'm still going to school. And as a young person, I'm jazzed up, I'm fired up, especially learning all I have. But among my generation, what I'm seeing is a big trend of injustice movements, like, stuff like Black Lives Matter, tax, and racial inequality, all this, there's great movement happening there. And I think there's a lot of potential to link up, because there's no greater injustice than what she was saying, nuclear, one city is worthy of protecting at, the expense of another city some, thousands of miles away. It's insane. And anybody in my generation, I'd like to think, would agree with me. And I know I'm a young person, I'm supposed to have the answers, but I'm asking you if you have any ideas for me when I go back to school to help tout that.
That's great. Let's bring the mic up here and do one last. I mean, your comment and your question have a relationship that I think Bea can speak to a little bit.
I'm Sister Ardath Platy, and this has been an issue that has been on my mind and work for many, many years, decades of years. And so I have more hope today after being part of ICAN and being with the young people from throughout the world. I am on fire, and I'm in my 80s. And so this is what I've learned. Go where the young people are. Like we've been in universities throughout this country since we've been with ICAN. Young people are yearning to learn about this treaty. They're angry that they're not told by their teachers. That's one thing. When Ray brought the Nobel Peace Prize in, we were at PACE, speaking at PACE, and then we went to speak with hundreds of high school students. They could hardly control themselves to touch the Nobel Peace Prize. When they had it in their hands and their pictures taken, it was like a conversion already of them. The other thing is, when we go into the universities, we learned, it was at Stony Brook University, that they were not showing the footprint of war on the environment. We could hardly believe it. So we did interviews all day long in those classes to show, scarred lands and wounded lives, where it gives all the wars, and then it shows the relationship on the environment. So then Poor People's Campaign started, and young people are part of that because they're working on poverty. They're in a lot of soup kitchens. Secondly, they were in racism as it relates to Black Lives Matter. I mean, we go to Black Lives Matter, and we go to all the environmental, and you go where the people are. That is really important. They're not in church. They are not in church for the most part, at least. Maybe you have a better experience than we do. But so, what I'm saying about this is when we went to the Bruderhof communities, they're peace people from way back. They had to leave Germany during the war quickly. They're making the peace cranes and taking the peace cranes into the politicians' offices. So if you go in the Austrian office, you'll see 100,000 peace cranes hanging. So wherever people are in their thinking, whatever issue they talk about, In the Poor People's Alliance, it's poverty, racism, militarism, environmental devastation, voting rights, and unionization. Those are the issues that Reverend Barber and Pastor Harris does, and they're working on every capital. So if we can become part of that and then become part where the treaty is definitely highlighted in it, nuclear weapons, abolish nuclear weapons, that's what it's about. We spent time with 25 offices today of the senators. They, they're very open to learning all about the treaty. They're very open to trying to get their senator to go on record with the pledge, with the parliamentary pledge. So, I mean, I think it's what's in our hearts and what's in our minds. And, we're turning it over to new generations, but we're still okay till we can walk and talk. And so when we have it inside of ourselves, when we go into a city, we try to talk with the politicians, we go to all the corporations, we go to all the military sites, and we make sure we challenge all those folks. We go to the universities, we go to the high schools. And so therefore, we try to give them the treaty so they know it. And then we follow up with like 12 things that are very pertinent to them that they could do. And then they make the choices and they develop the petitions. And then the college gets the petitions and then they continue from there. So those are some of the ideas that we've had experience with. And, there's many more too. I know.
Thank you. That's fantastic. I love it. Why don't you have the last word here, and then we're going to wrap up and have a little bit of time for people to have conversations before we close out at about 7:30. But
yeah,
comments?
I mean, I should probably, when we talk about engaging young people, I think that sort of intersectionality is really key here as well, and finding the topics that young people are interested in and passionate about. I came to this issue not because I was interested in nuclear weapons. I thought it was a useless issue, like old-fashioned, but because it was sort of a justice issue for me. Like it's an apartheid system, and the South African delegation coined this nuclear apartheid. We have two different rules in the world. Some countries are okay to have these weapons and they're allowed to have them, and some other countries not. And it's the ones with the power that are allowed to have them, and they get to set all the rules. So that's a sort of an injustice, inequality. And then, of course, I think that there's such a perspective on racism and colonialism that we haven't really talked about in the public, about the nuclear testing and the production of these weapons. And I just came back. I was in New Zealand in December, where they had a Pacific conference, and they had these university students from the Pacific Island states. And I've been to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I've heard the stories, but again, to hear a new generation talk about the pain of what is lying there underneath their island in Marshall Islands, this dome that is about, with the global warming now, another thing that we're doing to them is cracking. And when they discovered that through some expert presentations, that there's nothing they can do about it, I mean, they were like, why did you do this to us? And I think that kind of pain and injustice have to be brought up, and I think that also mobilizes action. So I think that and just in the United States, right, in Nevada, in an indigenous land, that's where they tested it. France tested in French Polynesia, in Algeria, Russia or Soviet tested in Kazakhstan, and China tested on their Muslim population. I mean, it's oppression, and it's people that didn't matter so much. And when nuclear weapons are flying, that's going to be the same thing again. It's not going to be the people in power that are going to suffer the most. And I think that's really the kind of perspective we have to, like a big global injustice. And I think that's what's so amazing about the treaty as well, is that it took a chip away at that in a way. And it's sort of staging a mini revolution on just this very limited things. I mean, we have a huge amount of problems in the world, but just these limited things, we flipped it around and said, we're no longer going, it's a revolution. We're going to have democracy on this issue. So majority decides. These weapons are illegal now. Sorry. I mean, they're not signing it yet, but it's still sort of a powerful way of looking at it, like a democratic sort of revolution almost. So I think that's really how we get to people and trying to articulate the stories. I think the human stories around this issue are so important, from the survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, from the test sites, from the people that are suffering today. I mean, just recently, like a year ago, I found out about St. Louis, that there are the material from the Manhattan Project in a suburb, Black community, obviously, where the leftover material from Manhattan Project in 1945 is now leaking and making people sick. And these are the things that we are now modernizing, right? And going to put into new production of material. So I think it's really important to make those kind of linkages and to put those stories and put the suffering of people, put a spotlight on that to kind of really show what these weapons are.
Thank you very much. I think it's terrific. I'll just say that I think all of us have been watching, you know, the what's happening. You mentioned the new members of Congress, but the bold ideas sometimes are what really captivate people and move people. And this treaty is a bold idea, but it is such a common sense idea. So we thank you for the work of ICAN, for your leadership there, but for all of the people in the audience who are working on this. It is tremendous effort. And you are, even if you don't know one another, you know, we are all part of a community together working on this. So thank you. Please hang out, have a chance to talk to Bea. We won't keep her too long because she probably needs to get some rest. But thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you so much.